Leviticus. I'm going to go through some notes that I think you will find valuable. We're not going to exactly take Brother Whitaker's outline and what he has planned for us this morning. Instead, we're going to look at some other brethren as to some of the work that they put forth. I think you'll find this valuable. I'm going to quote from an instructor who is not to be quoted from the school that Steve and I attended. Some of his notes that I think you'll find valuable. And then also, we're going to pull from what's called the Schertz Lectures. They had a lectureship in 2005 on the book of Leviticus, and I think you'll find that valuable as well. But let's just begin talking a little bit. And Steve, by the way, if you haven't taken the pop quiz, which it may be closed, by the way, now, if it is. Oh, it closes today, so you can still take it. So you might get some tips. But it was a very good pop quiz, by the way. I thought he was going to post it in regards to his own class, and I'm glad that he actually posted it in regards to some of our other study material. Keeps everyone honest in a way in terms of what it is we're trying to do, but encourages us as it relates to our continual study. And we're going to address actually one of the questions here in just a minute as it relates to the very title of the book. So the title of the book, Leviticus. Why do we call it the book of Leviticus? And that's interesting for a few reasons. So first off, let's take note of where it comes from. Why are we calling it? Why is it titled this? So the book of Leviticus, according to Alfred Edersheim, it's about the Levitical ordinances, derives its designation from the corresponding Greek term in the Septuagint translation, the LXX, and its Latin name in the Vulgate. Among the Jews, it is commonly known as the Vajikra, from the first word in the Hebrew text, Vajikra, he called. Okay? It may be objected that the name Leviticus does not fit the book. That is, that the book has less to do with the Levites than the priests. Regarding this, it is interesting to notice that the Levites, as such, are mentioned only once in the book, Leviticus 25, 32 through 34. However, it is important that one understand that the priests in question were Levitical priests. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 11. Of course, the priests, they came from the tribe of Levi. Actually, Leviticus could be called a training manual. A manual to be used by the priests to instruct Israel in regard to God's laws for them. The priests had the responsibility of teaching the people publicly. Note Deuteronomy 31 and verse 9, 33 and verse 10, and of course Nehemiah chapter 8. Charles Pledge states that the name of the book suggests the subject matter. The Levites and the priests in their service in the tabernacle, as this service relates to the people of Israel. In Leviticus, we see man brought into the presence of God, worshiping at the tabernacle. And so I think one of the actual summations of the first three books that I got was Genesis, you see the fall of man, the sin of man. Exodus, you see the deliverance of man. And then Leviticus, you see man being brought into the presence of God, the worship of man to God. And so that I thought that was interesting and relevant as you think about this text. Let's kind of go through a brief outline as it relates to this book and the relevance to it for us today. So first of all, in this book we find a lot about holiness. A lot about holiness. Now, what is holiness? What does it mean to be holy? Start there and let's kind of ask the question, why is that relevant to our world today? Or from a practical perspective, irrelevant. What is holiness? Set apart, be set apart, to be sanctified, holy, sanctified, saint, similar terms as it relates to spiritual purity. Now, the denominational world, they view holy as what? I keep getting in my news feed various articles on saints. I don't know if the Catholic Church is about to do something or what the reason is for it, but for some reason all these articles keep popping up about saints, the history of saints, the first saint in America, etc. The denominational world views holiness from what perspective? Oh, that's just for, really special people, right? That's for, what is that? Yeah, the clergy, right? The leaders of the religious organizations, not for us common folks. We don't need to be concerned with holiness. We don't need to be concerned with sanctification as it relates to our living and our way of life. We certainly are not saints, right? That's what the denominational world presents. That's their concept of this term, holiness. But that's not what we find in the Bible. The world gets it wrong, and we understand there's multiple reasons for that. So let's first start off and understand that God expects holiness as it relates to worship. He expects sanctity. He expects purity. He expects what He has commanded to be followed. And of course, we're probably most familiar with this concept as it relates to this book. Typically, what is the passage that we most often probably reference in our studies together out of the book of Leviticus? Anyone want to take a guess? Leviticus chapter 10, probably, right? Verses 1 and 2. Nadab and Abihu. Let's go there. And if someone could read that for me. Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2. Okay. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Thank you, brother. I was so ready to emphasize that point that God had not commanded it, but you see the outcome, which is important as well. And I think I've referenced to you somewhat even recently. Brother B.J. Clark was at a lectureship at Freed Hardman, and a brother stood up and was trying to say, unfortunately, God's commands regarding worship didn't matter. And Brother Clark said, "What about Nadab and Abihu?" He said, "Who cares about them? They're dead." And everyone kind of laughed, and Brother Clark's like, "Yeah, that's right. Why are they dead? They disobeyed God. That's the reason why they're dead." And the interesting piece here for us is that God had not commanded what was taking place. In other words, they did something that God had not given the command to do. And we understand that silence is not permission. When God is silent on a matter, that does not mean there is permission to engage in it. And we understand that as it relates from a practical perspective. If I tell my children that they're to play in the front yard, I don't then need to say that means don't play in the street. That means don't play on the train tracks. No, I said play in the front yard. So I don't need to all then go through the series of things they should not be doing. Well, God had given commands as it relates to the way in which He was to be approached, the way in which He was to be worshiped. And now He's being worshiped in a way which He has not commanded. Okay, and so the denominational world says, well, God didn't say anything that I couldn't use this, that I couldn't do that. I should be able to juggle in worship services. It's no big deal. That's the way in which we're going to choose to worship God. Wait a second. What has God commanded us to do? That's what we're supposed to do. And when we worship in a way which God has not commanded, we see the outcome here. Holiness in worship. Let's drop down to verse 10. Someone can read verses 10 and 11 of that same chapter.
That you may distinguish between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses.
Okay, so holy and unholy. God cares about whether or not we have made a distinction between that which is holy, that which He has commanded, that which is separate, sanctified, set apart from the world, and that which is just right in there with the world. Worship is not the place where we mingle in and bake in the current trends of society. That's not what we're doing here. We're not here to play the latest pop songs. We're not here to read about the latest trends concerning social life and interaction. That's not why we're here. We are here because we are seeking to be set apart from society, a special people to approach God. And let's see this now New Testament parallel here as you think about the concept of holiness as it relates to worship. Let's begin by going to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And let's look there. Someone could read for me verses 16 through 18. 2 Corinthians 6, verses 16 through 18.
In what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty.
What a special thing! What a special thing! The creator and sustainer of all the universe has said, separate from the grime of the world and come have fellowship with me. What a privilege! This isn't a chore. This isn't a burden. This is not some dreadful thing. What a blessing! God expects truth to be in His presence. Have you ever been in the midst of a pack of lies? Have you ever been in a context where it feels like you're in an alternate universe? You know, the boys visited the Illies recently. We had Samantha come and spend some time with our girls, and Murphy and Navy went and spent some time with the Illies, and the boys had an opportunity to worship at Woodstock. And Murphy was doing some research on Woodstock and was looking some things up, and what do you know? News video came up from one of the local TV stations about the Woodstock Church of Christ. And he started watching that video, and the way in which the narration was pitched, the tone, was how crazy the Woodstock Church of Christ was. And just, they were aghast at the actions that the congregation was taking. And the whole narrative, the whole feel of the segment was, who are these people? They're whack birds. That's the way they pitched it. Because the congregation withdrew from a sister who refused to give up her homosexual relationship. Folks, we listened to that as a family and we said, do you see how the entire context of what you're watching makes it feel like you're odd because of what you've been trained in? But yet, because you've been trained in what you've been trained in, you feel like what they're pitching is odd. You know that what's taking place there is just trafficking lies and falsehoods, giving an entire worldview that is inaccurate compared to the Bible. God expects truth. And we know what it's like to be in the presence of truth. We know what it's like to have fellowship with our brethren who align with God in His truth, and we as well, and the blessing of that. John chapter 4, verse 24. Jesus says regarding worship, God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. You think about maybe parenting for a second. Maybe you're trying to get to the bottom of a matter, or you're trying to wrestle through the context of maybe children or something that's taken place that you have oversight of. And what is it that you get frustrated about when you're not getting the full story of what's going on? In other words, I don't have time for these lies. What happened? Tell me what's going on. We are approaching God, the source of truth. He doesn't have time for lies and falsehoods. He doesn't have time, and we don't have the luxury or the right to offer up to Him something that is contrary to what He has commanded. What a blessing. Go ahead.
When I was growing up, my dad was on the school board, and they wanted to have this big dance, in not just our school, but in several schools around. And, oh, it wasn't just the Church of Christ. There were some denominations that stood against it too at that time. And oh, they just thought we were awful in that area because we wouldn't allow dances in school. We started having junior, senior banquets instead of dances.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were
Yeah.
like the Woodstock Church. I mean,
Yeah.
And like I said, it wasn't just the Church of Christ. But
Sure.
we were the, the
Right.
backbone of it, I'd say.
Right.
But I mean, we were just, people thought we were horrible.
Right.
And when I tell people I don't dance, why not?
Yeah. Right.
But that was a big thing back.
Sure. Sure.
Back in the early 50s. And,
Sure. Yeah.
we were condemned for it.
Sure. Well, and as it relates to the town square, we don't have much of a voice anymore in terms of society hearing what we have to say. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't change how we operate. We're still going to do what we're supposed to do, even though maybe the local town is no longer a dry county. Even though maybe the local town has all of a sudden brought in gambling and brought in strip clubs and brought in bars and all kinds of behavior and lifestyles that we oppose. But what happens is God's people sometimes think, well, you know what, society's now become this way, so we need to morph into how society behaves. No. Right. Right. Yes. Amen. That's right. That's right. So we see holiness in worship, and then right along the lines of where we're going and already describing here is holiness in living. Holiness in living. Let's look at Leviticus 6. If someone could read for me there verses 1 through 5. Leviticus 6 verses 1 through 5.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or about a pledge, or about a robbery, or if he has extorted from his neighbor, or if he has found what was lost in lies concerning it, and swears falsely, in any of these things that a man may do in which he sins, then it shall be, because he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore what he has stolen, or the thing which he extorted, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or the lost thing which he found, or all that about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore its full value, add 1/5 more to it, give it to whomever it belongs on the day of his trespassing offering.
Thank you, brother. So you see there the requirement for restitution, and in addition to what was taken, 20% more. You see there the moral standard as it relates to lying, the moral standard as it relates to stealing, the lifestyle as it relates to holy living. Let's think about that when we think about the New Testament and who we are. As we studied a little bit last week when we were looking at the tabernacle and the way it was constructed compared to the church, and remembering as well Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, those Old Testament patterns and standards that God had set up. That was a shadow of things to come that we now find in the New Testament. So let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2. And again, just be reminded, 1 Peter chapter 2, starting there in verse 4. Actually, let's start in verse 1. Let's start in verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking, as newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious, coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. I am separated for God's purpose. Yes, I'm rejected by men. I'm living in a way that is contrary to the way in which men live, but it's because I'm living for God. I'm not living in envy. I'm not living in deceit. I'm not living based upon evil. I'm living in righteousness as a child of God. Notice there in verse 5, you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so, this is not, again, what many in society would say as it relates to worship, where our holiness takes place and a certain standard takes place only in the context of worship. God says you're living stones. You're a holy priesthood. Yes, you offer up acceptable sacrifices to God, but the conduct of your life, your living, is defined by holiness. It's not just when we're entering these doors, it's how we live our life. Let's also read then in verse 9 as well, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. I want us to also look here at 1 Peter chapter 5. Actually, let's look at 1 Peter 4 first. Then we'll go to 1 Peter 5. If someone could read 1 Peter 4, verses 3 through... let's go 3 through... Let's just 3 and 4. 3 and 4 of 1 Peter 4. Yeah, just 4, that's fine. So, what happens when we decide to live holy lives? They're going to hate us. They're going to think we're odd. They're going to think we're strange. If you look back here, the context, notice back at chapter 2, in verse 10 again, who once were not a people, but now the people of God. Hey, you used to not be a covenant child of God. Now you are. In being a covenant child of God, you are not to live in deceit. You are to live in holiness. You are a special people. You are a child of God. You are a living stone. You are offering up spiritual sacrifices. Wait a second, that means I can't do what I used to do. Yes, that's correct. And what is it that you used to do? Well, you used to walk in lewdness. You used to walk in lusts. You used to walk in drunkenness, in drinking parties. These are the things that you used to do. Why? Because that's what the world does. That's what people who are unholy Not the people of God do. But that means everyone thinks I'm strange, that I don't do those things. Yes. Verse 4. God says they're going to think you're odd. Society thinks by default everyone drinks. It's getting to the point where society thinks by default everyone does drugs. Society thinks by default everyone uses filthy language. And what do they think when they see those who don't live that way? Something's wrong with those people. Those people make me feel uncomfortable. Those people don't do what I do, and I feel guilty, not because I have any idea as to why I shouldn't do it, but just because they're not doing it. And it makes me feel like I'm alone, and so I want them to do it too.
People think we don't have any fun.
For sure.
I've been told that, well, you never have any fun.
Sure.
We have fun in different ways.
Sure.
But I can't even tell you how many thousand times I've been saying, never have any fun.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting as well because if you look in this same exact book, I want you to notice chapter 3. Exactly what Sister Sharon's saying. Notice chapter 3. Someone read for me verse 10. Actually, let's read 10 through 12. 1 Peter 3, 10 through 12. Okay. So is God telling us here in what we've just read, and you think about chapter 2 and chapter 4, is God telling us that we're not supposed to love life? Is that what God is impressing upon us, that we should not desire to enjoy life? No, quite the contrary. God is saying, love life, and this is how you do it. And folks, let's think about the practicality of this. Let me ask you a question. What happens to the lives of those who engage in drinking alcohol, using filthy language, filling their life with fornication, lust? What's the reality of their mental status, their emotional status, their physical status? Do they really love life? They may love life in that blip of ecstasy that they think they're experiencing. But what's the outcome thereof? We know what that is. We know what that is. And so God is instructing us in all these things, not because He doesn't want us to enjoy life. Quite the contrary. He wants us to enjoy life.
We just enjoy it in different ways.
Well, we truly enjoy it because we enjoy it in holiness, which is where it's possible to enjoy it. And that's the message that's being missed here. That's what our young people don't gain in terms of what this is all about. This isn't a rule book to constrain us and limit us in terms of all the fun we could be having. No! This is a book that guides us in terms of all the life that we could absolutely be loving. The book of Leviticus is a book about holiness. Let's look there as well. Chapter 10, if someone could read for me verse 9, again, back to Leviticus. Chapter 10 and verse 9. Leviticus 10 and verse 9. All right, and let's go back to 1 Peter. And remember already what he's wrote in chapter 4, verse 3. 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's notice there verse 6. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. Casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. I have a question. When you are filled with care, when the world is filled with care, what is the temptation? Escape your problems. How do you escape your problems according to the pattern of the world? Drink. Right? I find the answer to my problems at the bottom of my fifth of liquor. Of course, right. But you see here the context. Peter's saying, cast your care before God. Wait a second, preacher. How does that have anything to do with drinking? Verse 8, be sober. What's the command according to God? Be sober. Be sober. Be sober. But preacher, that takes work. That means in order for me to get to carefree, I got to spend a ton of time releasing all the crazy stress that's in my life. Stress from children, stress from society, stress from work, stress from money, stress from family. Stress. That's a lot of work to get rid of that. Yes. God says, pray. Cast your care upon me. A preacher, it's so much easier just to drink. God says, be sober. God says, not the preacher, not me. God says, be sober. But preacher, that's hard. I get it. I get it. Now all of a sudden prayer isn't just something I'm doing mechanically. I am now casting my care, releasing it off my shoulders in the presence of God. Holiness in worship, holiness in living, holiness in identity. We don't have much time for this one, so we'll see how quickly we can get through it. Leviticus chapter 6, notice there in verse 10. Leviticus 6 and verse 10, and the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen trousers he shall put on his body, and take up the ashes of the burnt offering, which the fire has consumed on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. Notice also chapter 8. Chapter 8. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, verse 1, verse 2, take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments with anointing oil, a bull as the sin offering, 2 rams, and a basket of unleavened bread, and gather all the congregation together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. And the congregation was gathered together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And Moses said to the congregation, this is what the Lord commanded to be done. Then Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. And he put the tunic on him and girded him with the sash, clothed with the robe, and put the ephod on him. And he girded him with the intricately woven band of the ephod, and with it tied the ephod on him. And he put the breastplate on him, and he put the Urim and the Thummim in the breastplate. And he put the turban on his head. Also on the turban, on its front, he put the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord had commanded Moses. It sounds like we're going to be able to identify these priests. Now, translate to the denominational world. How do they view identity in terms of holiness? The priests wear that fancy priestly garb, don't they? That's not what God has commanded us. God has commanded us to live our lives putting on a lifestyle of holiness. Living our lives in all holy conversation or all holy conduct. 1 Peter 1 verse 15, 2 Peter 3 and verse 11. Putting on the new man, putting off that old man. Ephesians chapter 4 verses 24 through 25. I just think that this is helpful for us to look at. I know that was the second bell. But Brother B.J. Clark, back in 2005, has a comparison here in terms of the way in which Identity was challenged. Holiness was challenged. Morality was challenged back in the 1940s in the school system compared to the way it's challenged today. Well, even worse today. This is a comparison between 1990 and 1940. But in terms of behavior and identity, in terms of challenges as it relates to holiness, guess what the school system said they were challenged with in the 1940s? Talking in class was number one. Number two, chewing gum. Number three, making noise. Number four, running in the halls. Number five, cutting in line. Number six, dress code violations. Number seven, littering. 1990s, number one, drug abuse. Number two, alcohol abuse. Number three, pregnancy. Number four, suicide. Number five, rape. Number six, robbery. Number seven, assault. Hannah was talking to the photographer at the elementary school who does photo shoots for the local school systems. He said he was down in a school in Fulton County, and he said, well, he was there, fight after fight after fight, breaking out in the schools, just the whole day. The whole day. Teachers just completely powerless. Folks, our identity is not defined by the world. It's just going to continue to go down the path it's going down. Our identity is defined by God's word and our alignment with it, seeking to live holy lives. Thank you all very much.